The Zelda series is no stranger to the leitmotif. Examples of leitmotifs can be found consistently throughout the franchise, such as Zelda's Lullaby, an iconic song that has worked its way into many of the games. From A Link to the Past, to Ocarina of Time, and even Skyward Sword. For those unfamiliar with what a leitmotif is, allow me to explain. When you're watching a film or a play, or in our case, playing a game, and a song begins to play when a character comes on screen, that's a leitmotif. As simple as that. A short, recurring piece of music that helps the audience to identify the arrival of a character. Think of Darth Vader's theme. You know he's coming before he arrives, because of his leitmotif. But you may be wondering why I am talking about leitmotifs and the Zelda franchise. Well, I was recently reading an article discussing the music of Ocarina of Time, and I stumbled upon a phrase that caught my attention. Let me read you an excerpt. Quote, "Composer Koji Kondo again uses particular melodic themes to identify specific areas of the game world in something like Wagner's leitmotifs acting in reverse." The last phrase in particular caught my eye. Leitmotifs acting in reverse. What does it mean to have a reverse leitmotif? Well, the author, Zach Whalen, builds upon this in a later sentence. Quote, "The stationary audience witnesses a very large number of performers pass through the space in a Wagnerian opera. But in the Ocarina of Time, the audience travels and the leitmotifs are attached to the stationary environments of Hyrule." Okay, so with that in mind, let's try to define what a reverse leitmotif is. To start with, there's someone mentioned in these quotes we haven't discussed yet. Richard Wagner. Now, Wagner was quite notable for the use of the leitmotif in his opera plays, using music as a tool to clearly identify characters to the audience as they appeared on stage. In the context of an opera, a heavily rehearsed and structured stage play, Wagner has complete control over when and where the leitmotifs will play. But this is where a leitmotif in a video game differs. A developer can curate an environment for a player, but the progress in the game often depends almost entirely on the player's action. If a player does not move, the game will often not move either. So a developer cannot play the musical theme for a town in the game when it arrives on screen, as the player dictates when the town will arrive on screen. So instead, the player's action dictates when the musical theme will play. To put it simply, a leitmotif signals the arrival of a character to the audience, whereas a reverse leitmotif signals the audience's arrival at the character. When considering Ocarina of Time, this reverse leitmotif is quite a plausible theory. Songs are linked to specific environments in the game, and usually only play in the one spot as the player approaches them. Songs like Kakiri Forest or Gerudo Valley. But I'd like to turn our sights to more recent years and consider how the reverse leitmotif theory may apply to modern Zelda games, such as Breath of the Wild. Are the leitmotifs of this game attached to the stationary environments of Hyrule as they were back in Ocarina of Time? Yes, they absolutely are. Perhaps more than ever. Allow me to explain. One of the biggest complaints voiced about Breath of the Wild was in regards to the music. In comparison to previous Zelda games where most environments of the game would have an accompanying music track, the open world is quite musically barren, apart from a handful of piano melodies. But where this isn't the case is in the towns and villages of the game. When you step foot into Kakariko Village or Zora's Domain, there's a clear musical leitmotif that begins to play. Embracing this same reverse leitmotif theory of a leitmotif being linked to a specific environment in the game and only playing as the player approaches them. Another example of a reverse leitmotif in Breath of the Wild is the Great Fairy Fountains. These are places hidden throughout the world that have a clear musical leitmotif begin to play as the player approaches them. It's a perfect use of the theory, as these spots are usually hidden on purpose, with the player's goal being to find them. So by having a piece of music signal to the player that they are approaching these static locations, they are able to clearly identify that they are almost at their goal. Not only are these clear examples of where the reverse leitmotif theory is present in Breath of the Wild, but it's also an insight into how the application of the theory has changed in the series. Ocarina of Time was released on the N64, which was Nintendo's first 3D console. This meant that the huge adventure the developers wanted had to be split up into different zones. For example, the sprawling plains of Hyrule Field and Kakariko Village were two distinctly different areas with different musical leitmotifs. If the player wanted to travel between the two, they had to wait for a fade to black transition as the console loaded in the next zone. This meant a very clear difference between the two locations. But in Breath of the Wild, there are no loading screens as the player walks from one part of the world to another. This seamless method of travel means that as the player naturally walks from Hyrule Field to Kakariko Village, the musical theme of Kakariko Village will quietly fade in, before playing the full song as they arrive at the village. This is a perfect application of the reverse leitmotif, as the village theme begins playing as the player begins approaching the village, quietly fading in to signal to the player that they are almost at their intended goal. I'd argue that this is a much stronger example of the reverse leitmotif theory, as we can clearly see this signal to the player, instead of a fade to black loading screen transition. But some of you might be thinking, now hang on, there are loading screens in Breath of the Wild. And you're right, entering a handful of specific locations does prompt a loading screen. But it's usually in places that are not part of the open world, such as a shrine. When the player chooses to enter one of these shrines, the same musical theme plays within every shrine. This is a clear application of the reverse leitmotif theory in the same method as present within Ocarina of Time. A loading screen clearly separates the two zones with a musical theme playing to signal the player's arrival at the shrine. The fact that the same music is used in every shrine is an incredibly clear example of a leitmotif, symbolizing the stationary environment. As I was brainstorming about the possible applications of reverse leitmotifs present in Breath of the Wild, there was one key example that stuck out in my mind: the Guardian theme. Now this is an interesting one, as I think you could make an argument for this music being either a leitmotif or a reverse leitmotif. On the one hand, you could say that the music begins playing as the player approaches the enemy, signaling clearly to them that they are in a dangerous position. But on the other hand, the player can get as close to the enemy as they want, but if the enemy doesn't spot them, the dramatic music doesn't begin playing. It's only when the enemy spots the player that the music starts, signaling to the player that danger is approaching. Personally, in this case, I would classify this as a leitmotif. But what do you think? The reverse leitmotif theory is at its strongest when discussing static elements of a game that produce music. But when the elements of the game producing music begin to move around independently of the player's movement or action, it becomes trickier to determine if these musical themes are classified as strictly a leitmotif or a reverse leitmotif. This isn't said in an attempt to discredit the legitimacy of the theory, not at all, but just to make it clear that not every musical theme is a reverse leitmotif just because it's a video game. There are still plenty of normal leitmotifs present in the series, like Zelda's Lullaby, as I outlined at the start of the video. Before we finish up, I'd like to make it clear that my intention is not to critique the theory proposed in Wayland's article, but to instead embrace what it is saying and ask if the theory has continued to be prevalent throughout the series in the 20 years since the article was written. And if you ask me, I think it has become more relevant than ever before. But what do you think? Is there such a thing as a reverse leitmotif? what are some examples of reverse leitmotifs you can think of? I'd like to thank Zach Whalen for his writing, as it was a huge inspiration for this video. The article is titled Play Along, An Approach to Video Game Music, and I'd highly recommend checking it out if you're at all interested in the themes we discussed today, as they're just a small part of a much larger piece. Thanks for watching!